And we'll just give a moment for folks to come in and just watch the little ticker of participants. And once it starts to slow down, we'll get started, everyone. All right, well, we will get started. Welcome everybody back to hopefully you were able to join us for the first session this morning at 10, but welcome to our second breakout session here for the Social Workers Confronting Racial Injustice Conference. I'm really happy to be here. I'm Bethany Matson. I'm one of the co-chairs for the conference. And I'm really excited about this presentation that we have today, Transforming Mental Health Histories of Resistance and Cross-Movement Strategies for a Liberatory Future. So before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to share our acknowledgement to the land we are on. I am here on the UW-Madison campus. And so on behalf of the planning committee for this conference, I ask that you join me in acknowledging that our University of Wisconsin-Madison campus resides within the sacred homeland of the Ho-Chunk people, a place they call Dejo or Four Lakes. We respectfully recognize the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk people and the other 11 First Nations of Wisconsin. Whether you are watching this from the land of these 12 First Nations or you are more distant, we encourage you to learn about the history of the land you are on. As social workers, we have a duty to look critically at the role our profession has played in attempted cultural genocide and destruction of Indigenous families, as well as was the aim of boarding schools. This conference aims to bring clarity about the past, but also seeks to challenge and inspire all of us into action in our work in communities to support Indigenous rights and racial equity. As a reminder today, this presentation is being recorded and will be available on our conference website at a later date. Before I introduce our speakers today, just a few Zoom info items. To access this presentation, you were required to provide your name and email. This allowed us to log our attendees and email you information on CEUs for this presentation, which will be distributed via email at a later date. Your cameras and microphones will remain muted, but we do have a Q&A feature where you can submit questions for our presenters, and we will leave time, at the end of the presentation to try to answer those, but please be aware that just to the number of attendees and time, we may not be able to get to all of the questions submitted, but we'll try to get to a few of them. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce our presenters. We have today from the Institute for the Development of Human Arts, or IDHA, Noah Gokul and Nia Nelson. So I will turn it over to you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Bethany, and thank you all for tuning into this session. I'm very excited to share some of it about IDHA and the work that we do. And my name is Noah Gokul. I use they, them pronouns. I'm the program manager at IDHA. I'm joined alongside with Nia here, who will introduce themselves. And we are here to talk about histories of resistance and cross-movement strategies for a liberatory future. So I'll get into a little bit about what that means. We're really, wanting to root these different struggles that have existed inside and outside the formal mental health system to, try to make change, and then thinking about how these struggles coincide with many different movements across disability, racial justice, abolition of prisons, and thinking about all of these different movements and how they can further, work together and create pathways towards new care systems. So these are really troubling times, obviously, that we're in, and so this is a very important conversation to be talking about, in my opinion. And yeah, I'm really grateful for you all to tune in. So yeah, let's get it started. So this is a little overview of what we're going to talk about. Um, we'll first introduce ourselves and ground in what we're going to share. And then we'll get into talking about the mental health and the carceral system. And then we'll go into some histories of resistance that I just spoke about around mental health. And then thinking about how all of this works together to build a more cross-movement vision and cross-movement organizing approach. And then at the end, we're gonna do our best to try to make some time for Q&A. And so yeah, yeah, hopefully, Nia and I will try to keep each other accountable on that, on timing. And it's supposed to be a workshop. This is the it's called a workshop, but unfortunately, we won't be able to see you all or hear from you all, but hopefully you can feel our presence just radiating from your screen or however you're tuning in. And so, yeah, next slide. So we wanted to start off with, I really appreciated the land acknowledgement that Bethany did. And so we wanted to do this grief and genocide acknowledgement. And this is really to acknowledge, the grief that I feel I'm really showing up with. And I think checking in with me, like we both kind of talked about, not really feeling the best today. And how that grief, I think as a organization that is talking about mental health, how we think about these struggles and the times that we are in, how they're affecting us, is really crucial. So, I'm thinking about Palestine, Congo, and the many different struggles and grief that they may cause, that I hope that you can also feel like that grief can be present with you as well, and that it can show up in this space that is very much welcome and really important to feel as we move through these different topics today. So I hope that you can feel like that is really really welcome. And this is a acknowledgement that we're inspired by Umu Saila, who is an amazing person who talks about this in their work. So yeah, next slide. So a little bit about myself, and I also wanted to do a visual description because I forgot about it in the beginning. But my name is Noah Gokul. I use they, them pronouns. I am a brown person with long black hair. I'm wearing a keffiyeh right now with a brown sweater. And behind me in my background is a white wall. And I mentioned I'm the program manager at IDHA. We'll talk about what the heck is IDHA. But I've been with IDHA for almost 3 years now, which is amazing as a staff, but I also was part of the community for since kind of its beginning, in and out. But I also come to this work before doing this work as a uh, staff at IDHA. I was a peer specialist and I worked with young adults alongside in a program for young adults with first episode psychosis. And, I also am someone who identifies as having lived experience. I like to use the terminology that I have sensitivities to the world. And, I feel like that makes more and more sense as the world gets even more um, and or really showing the shadow. The shadow is coming to the light, and part of the work that I do to heal and to understand and make meaning out of my experiences is through art. So I'm also an artist. I used to be really into making music, so that's part of my journey. More doing visual art now, And lastly, also believing in mental health liberation, and so identify as a mental health activist. And I'll pass it over to Nia to introduce themselves.
Yeah, thank you so much, Noah, for the great introduction and the grief and genocide acknowledgement. And thank you, Bethany, for all your help today. My name is Nia Nelson. I use they, she pronouns. As a visual description, I am a light-skinned Black femme. I have I guess, cheetah print head wrap on. I'm sitting on a orange couch, and behind me I have some artwork. If you can't see it that clearly, it says abolish police, and it has someone holding up a burning pig mask. And yeah, just a little about me. I am the administrative coordinator at IDHA. I've been here for about 9 months, so I am a bit newer to the IDHA community, but feel very valued and held here, and I really appreciate that the work that we do and the community that I've built since being here. Um, about my background, I am a longtime organizer. I've been organizing pretty much since high school. I've been a student organizer in the South, in North Carolina specifically. I'm located in Brooklyn right now, but that's where a majority of my organizing took place. A lot of anti-racism organizing, liberation theology, and things of that sort. Queer justice and liberation and things. That's a lot of the work that I've done. And I'm also an herbalist, so I spend a lot of time outside connecting with the land and the healing power of the herbs, and really leaning into medicinal herb or herbal medicinal making, herb making and things of that sort. Just as like a healing practice and like a building a relationship with the land, and just thinking about yeah, just the healing power that the land gives us, and just building tools that I feel like are really important for our movement. I'm also an artist, mainly with music. I produce, I DJ. I'm like really, really into music, specifically as like a healing practice. I like to transmute my feelings and experiences and things into playlists and mixes, and try to do a lot of storytelling through the music that I share with people. So that is something that um, is really, really important to me and a big part of how I show up in spaces. And I also am a person with lived experience. Similarly to Noah, I would identify myself as someone who has sensitivities to the world, and just coming from what I would say is like a lineage of mad people, where we'll get more into the mad identity as we get deeper into this presentation. But yeah, so that also informs a lot about how I show up in the space and the work that I do and why I do the work that I do. And go to the next slide. So just to introduce IDHA, the Institute of Development in Human Arts. So we are a community of current and aspiring mental health practitioners, survivors, service users, activists, artists, family members, researchers, and advocates who are interested in exploring the link between personal and societal transformation. Our biggest mission is to proliferate an understanding of mental health that acknowledges and addresses the numerous contexts in which our mental health exists. So like Noah mentioned at the beginning, there's a lot going on in the world with the rising authoritarianism and fascism and genocide and all the grief that we're experiencing, battling, ableism, saneism, racism, classism, all the things. So our mental health exists in a lot of contexts that inform, how we experience our body minds. So that's really something that we seek to address and center in our approach to mental health. And our vision is for a transformed world that encourages people and communities in a capacity to heal and offer a vast range of personal and collective healing practices that are available to all. So we pull from a lot of different bodies of work and frameworks and lineages that inform the work that we do, because there is a lot of beautiful wisdom that, has been with us for decades and centuries. And there's a lot of personal experiences that people have had that they can bring to the work that we do, that we value very closely. And a bit more about who we are and who we are in community with. So we work a lot with mental health professionals. So this includes psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, peer specialists, somatic healers, and other professionals. also people with lived experience, so current and prior service users, survivors of trauma and psychiatric abuse, and peers, so like peer specialists and things of that sort, like Noah mentioned, and then advocates, so family members, caregivers, activists, artists, teachers, and community members. And yeah, I think this just highlights, just the community building aspect of building a transformative mental health framework, and kind of what this presentation is about today, cross-movement organizing. It requires, the input and the labor and the wisdom and the tools of very many different types of people. So these are a lot of the people that we are in community with and we work with. And more about what we do. So we do education and training. So we have like a training series, and we do community events and lots of things of that sort. We do that to disseminate knowledge about transformative mental health frameworks, strategies, and tools. We also do a lot of community building. So we facilitate creative exchange and collaboration through events, resource sharing, and a membership program. So we do have like members that we do gatherings with and allow space for them to do their own events and things of that sort. So there's a lot of different things we do. And the most important one for this current presentation is cross-movement organizing. So we do work to build bridges between movements that are dismantling all forms of oppression as they intersect with mental health. So kind of like I mentioned before, our mental health exists in various contexts. I mentioned, in the context of genocide and rising fascism, classism, disability justice, ableism, all those sorts of things. So a big part of this presentation today will be talking about the lineages we pull from and kind of the strategies that we use to, do this cross-movement work. And here we have a collection of images we have some books and some logos from some organizations that we partner with. And this is just to show, the community we've built and some of the lineages that we pull from with our work. So just to describe a few, up here on the top left, we have the Icarus Project, which is a real seminal organization that is deeply connected to IDHA's work. And a lot of people who are part of that have informed the creation of IDHA. Similarly, we have, Sins Invalid down here in the bottom right corner. We have Spring Up, which is a consulting and community education organization that does a lot of transformative justice work. And to mention some of the books that we have here of frameworks that we pull from: Emergent Strategies by Adrienne Marie Brown. I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with that. Healing Justice Lineages by Kara Page. And so there's a lot of different things up here. We just wanted to just show, kind of like I said before, the cross-movement organizing and a lot of the lineages and frameworks and bodies of work that we pull from to inform the work that we do. And I will pass it to Noah to talk more about mental health and the carceral system.
Thank you, Nia. Yeah, and I just wanted to reiterate that we'll have a Q&A at the end. And if you want to use the question and answer function on Zoom to pose a question, you can feel free to do that. We might be able to answer them during the presentation, but otherwise Bethany can like take note of those and feed those questions to us at the end. So feel free to use that function. So I'm going to talk to you about the mental health and carceral system. And so just trying to ground a little bit in this conference, this is, social workers confronting racial injustice. So I would venture to kind of think that, you all are thinking about the how the prison industrial complex is intertwined with the work that you do, and how your work as a social work, how does that really connect to the carceral system, the prison system, and one of those interconnections is through racism, right? And thinking about Black and brown people, how they are oftentimes overly policed, overly incarcerated, and then also are overrepresented when it comes to these kind of like involvement with mental health, police kind of crisis things that go south. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But yeah, I'm just kind of locating ourselves so that we can kind of like all be here together. So I hope that, I feel like people probably have some understanding of some of this a little bit already. So yeah, we'll get into it. So next slide. So this is a quote that we wanted to start off with from Stella Aqua Mensa, Stephanie, both people who are with lived experience who identify as psychiatric survivors. This is a quote that says, "Those of us who have survived psychiatric incarceration know that not only did the asylum never die, but it is and always was another prison. Knowing the truth of these myths, we work towards writing a new story." So really linking the idea of prison with asylum, right? Like asylum being a prison with another name, and how institutions, psychiatric institutions of today can be seen as prisons because people cannot leave in their own will, and oftentimes, people who are in these kind of settings are being very much pathologized, and might have kind of be like a black person and kind of these like intertwined intersections. So this is a quote from Abolition Must Include Psychiatry, a article that these two folks made, and this is a picture of two of them. So next slide. So just a little bit of history of the field and how it relates to the carceral system. So psychiatry, psychology, and social work have deep roots in state and social control. So during the US slavery times, there was a diagnosis that was created by a doctor during the time called drapetomania. I always have struggle pronouncing that. A mental disease that explained why enslaved Black people in the antebellum South ran away. So this is, an example of kind of how the psychiatry was being used to, kind of justify or continue social control. And then there also was an overdiagnosis of schizophrenia during the civil rights era of towards Black men. And this was kind of a way that there was a pathologization of aggression, right? Of like people trying to fight for their freedom, their civil rights, that was being pathologized. And so there was this author named Jonathan Metzl who wrote a book called The Protest Psychosis, which is on the bottom right. And that is all about that concept. And then the top is this doctor who came up with this ridiculous diagnosis, drapetomania. And then below, the goal of treatment, on foundationally, there is this kind of norm that we think of when it comes to behavior. So this norm is based on white, middle, and upper class, cis-het, right, able-bodied, and sane men. So the DSM, you all are probably familiar with the DSM, was thinking about this norm, had this norm in mind when writing this kind of literature, scientific literature. And so when it comes to who is left out of that norm, this targets people of color, trans, queer folks, and disabled folks, neurodivergent folks, poor folks, anyone who doesn't fit within that normative category. Next slide, please. So looking at some modern day manifestations. So, thinking about how when white people and people of color present similar symptoms, there's often a different treatment. So Black, Latino, Hispanic children are more likely to be diagnosed with this diagnosis of oppositional disorder. Can't remember the second D. Oppositional something disorder than ADD. And Black adults are more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia than PTSD. And so, we were seeing some different treatment based on people's racial background. And then when it comes to New York City, there's this Kendra law that is basically taking people's rights away and saying that they need to have forced treatment. So 77% of these orders are implemented against Black and brown people in New York City. So why does this matter? Police are often still first responders to mental health crisis calls. So, interfacing with police, that's gonna really, impact people of color significantly. And then also 50% of all people killed by the police in the US are disabled. So there's a disproportionate high number of those killed who are also Black. Next slide. So here's another example just in New York City where there's a increase. Mayor Adams is starting to instate these policies, or has been starting to instate these policies to institutionalize homeless people. So trying to do these street sweeps, right? So this is kind of a way that there is a pathologization of poor people, of people who might be presenting as having a mental health challenge, and basically criminalizing them, putting them in hospitals without their consent. Next slide. And then another relevant example is Sonia Massey, who was a Black disabled woman who was killed by the police after she was calling the police after she was afraid of someone, breaking into her house. And then the police came in and they, because she was presenting as having some sort of, mental health crisis, in their opinion, she was shot and killed. And so this is kind of another example of how this is carrying out, intertwining prison and mental health. Next slide. So some parallels between prisons and psych hospitals. People of color are disproportionately overrepresented in both of these settings. There's also disregard for rights and safety of trans and non-binary people in both of these settings. Law enforcement is the response and transport. Solitary confinement and seclusion in cells equals neglect. Forced medication is used in both. Physical restraints, violence, and physical abuse are the norm, and sexual assault is routine with protections poorly enforced. So pretty bleak and unsettling things to think about. And so this is kind of just the reality of how these things are intertwined and connected. Next slide.
So this is me. Yeah, so just to give a bit of context of some of the programs that IDHA puts on that we're going to talk about. Here we see around 2020 with the George Floyd protests, just some information about, sentiments people were having at the time about, we don't need cops to become social workers and we need peer support, and how social workers are rejecting calls for them to replace the police. Because in response to some of these things, a lot of people had sentiments that, instead of police officers being responders to mental health crisis, it should be social workers. And a lot of people wanted to push back on this, just with the idea of, what Noah just shared, that, sometimes these mental health systems, oftentimes they do still operate as a carceral system, with a lot of people's rights being taken away, a lot of violence taking place, a lot of marginalized people being disproportionately harmed. within these systems. So yeah, so there was just a lot of conversation in 2020 around, like defunding the police and reallocating those resources to mental health. And a lot of people just wanted to ground that replacing cops with care may be well-intentioned, but if you listen to the lived experiences of psychiatric survivors and families and advocates who have had experiences in these systems, that they very much too operate in a very oppressive and carceral way. So this segues into, let me get to the next slide. Decarcerating care, which is one of IDHA's cross-movement organizing programs that we do. So with this, it's really us having the goal that, the MAD movement, the transformative mental health movement can be in conversation with the prison abolition and police defunding movements, just to make sure that we're amplifying the work that has been happening at this intersection for a really long time. So with this program, IDHA is seeking to, just discuss alternatives to policing and the criminal justice system that is rooted in the lived experience of people who have survived mental health systems and things of that sort. So sometimes when we think about, kind of like I mentioned before, people think that, the mental health system is an alternative to these to prisons or like police responses, but decarcerating care really seeks to ground in the racist roots of a lot of the carceral systems, like both the mental health system as a carceral system and the prison system, and just identifying the mental health system as another carceral system that also seeks to maintain control of marginalized people, Black and brown bodies, and how those people are disproportionately affected. So just to read what's on the screen here, decarcerating care, as abolitionists and organizers call to divest funding from the police, and some advocate for reallocation of mental health care. IDHA's ongoing talk series draws attention to the ways in which the mental health care system maintains white supremacist racial hierarchies and operates on logic of surveillance, coercion, and control, rooted in the lived experience of mental health service users and survivors, movement leaders, and disabled community members. So far we've had 8 virtual events. We've had 40 amazing panelists, arraying from, people with experience, survivors, activists, service providers. So even some, clinicians like sharing their experiences of how they're doing the work within the system to work towards more liberatory care. We've had thousands of registrations. So lots of people have come through because obviously this is a very pressing topic and something that, a lot of people have been thinking about for a very long time. And yeah, 15,000 views on YouTube. Again, that this is clearly a conversation that a lot of people want to be attending to at this time. And thinking about, using lineages of resistance and lineages of community care, and also finding spaces for like our radical imagination to imagine, what different ways of liberatory care can look like. And on this slide here, we have some graphics from our past panels. As you can see, if you read some of the titles of these, they're all at the intersection of, like I said, policing and mental health. So reading some of the themes that we've had. So one is taking policing out of mental health crisis response. Another is challenging criminalization and control in mental health. We have community-based healing alternatives and how to build them, and also laying the foundations for liberated practice. And you can see some of these pictures of, as I mentioned, the amazing panelists. So yeah, just regrounding in that a lot of the work that decarcerating care seeks to do is to just interrogate, not interrogate quite, but like, look deeply into the current mental health system and how it operates as a carceral system, and also how it works in tandem with prison systems and things of that sort. And then look to, like I mentioned before, past lineages of how, community care has operated, ancestral lineages of care, just different systems that people have relied upon for care, and how can we draw upon that wisdom and go back to that. And also, like I mentioned, how we can use our radical imaginations to like lay a foundation for more liberated mental health care practices. And we're going to have a small break, so we will come back in about 5 minutes. So that is 1:40 p.m. Eastern time, that we'll be back. So thank y'all for being here this far, and we will pop back in about 5 minutes.
All righty. So I hope you had a nice little break. We're gonna jump in to histories of resistance. I saw somebody in the Q&A asked what is the MAD movement? And so I'm going to talk about that just now. So you are right here on time with that. And I'm going to try to go a little quicker because we never have enough time for these things. So we want to go get to the cross movement organizing. We're going to get these slides. I hope that it's okay. I kind of might speed through a little bit, and it's not going to be able to go so deep. These, like the concepts in these slides, could really go deep. So I'm going to try my best. All right, let's go. So there was this movement in the 60s and 70s that was really inspired by the civil rights movement at the time. And so there was groups of people who were ex mental health patients who started to really come together and organize. And they were really starting to talk about how messed up the system was, and how awful the treatment that they were receiving was, enforced treatment and all that. So they were creating spaces for peer support. And some of these people rejected the biomedical model, and the whole like medical way of treatment, and they fought to abolish psychiatry. Others, they were more embracing their diagnosis, and they were trying to tried funding for services, but they all agreed that the human rights was abysmal in these places. So that was a big, big influence to what paved the way for the Mad Pride movement, which emerged more in the 90s. And this was a movement that people were really starting to reclaim this word mad and crazy. And, similar to the word like queer, for example, that they were really taking pride in their madness. And they found community and organizing connection through that. And people still today really use this word mad to take pride in not being of the norm. Next slide. So this is kind of just a little taste of there's a whole global movement outside the US that existed. There was an ex-patient and consumer psychiatric survivor movement in the 80s and 90s that happened, and then today there is so many different groups who are doing important work outside of the US to ensure the rights and protection of people who are labeled with the diagnosis, and fight for liberation as well. So these are all these different groups. Red Lime, for example, down in Peru. There's Bapu Trust in India. There's the ISPS International Society for Psychological and Social Approaches to Psychosis. So we're just giving you a sense that beyond the US, there is a lot of solidarity, and it's important to tap into that. And next slide. So here's a little bit of resistance that has existed within the system. So in the 1960s, there was this movement called anti-psychiatry. So it really talked about how psychiatry is a system of control, and that we really need to abolish this system. It can't be reformed. And then moving from that place, there has been an ongoing a more community and social approach that does kind of concern itself with evidence that does not support a solely biological approach to mental health, and emphasizes that we need to talk about context and social setting and consider alternatives. So it kind of has moved to integrating more psychiatry instead of rejecting it. Next slide. And then in the 1950s and 60s as well, there was a lot of global work happening. So you might all be familiar with Frantz Fanon, who was doing some important work in Algeria and critiquing the psychiatric system. So thinking about the colonial presence within mental health systems, and the foundation is colonial, and so thinking about the belief that it's grounded in belief that the psyche is directly impacted by every political situation, and thinking about an encouragement of community building rather than forcing people to be submitted to medical authority. And then Ignacio Martin Baró was a psychologist who talked about liberation psychology. So it focused on the action of communities, the knowledge of communities that have been historically excluded and marginalized, and explores the effects of power and on the oppressed and the impacts of injustice and violence on our mental health. So this has really paved the way for a robust, vibrant movement that we can see today, that IDHA is we like to see ourselves as part of, and so Nia will talk about that.
Thank you, Noah. Yeah, so I guess the meat of this presentation is about cross-movement organizing, kind of like I mentioned before, in terms of, mental health and how people experience their mental health or madness or their psychosocial disability, whatever terminology they use to describe the experience in their body minds. It's very much informed by so many different things. Like we talk about racism, classism, ableism, fascism, all the things. So considering that, our mental health exists in the context of all of these things, it is very, very crucial that a lot of the movement work that we do crosses into these other movements, whether that's disability justice or racial justice, or like working with poor folk and the things that the movements that they've made to advocate for themselves. So, and just things of that sort. So just gonna get into that a little bit more. So here we have a quote by my fave, Audre Lorde. There is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. So yeah, like I mentioned before, the context of our mental health is impacted by so many different things, and rarely is it ever that a marginalized person is marginalized in one way. So a lot of people who live in subjected bodies that are multiply marginalized, yeah, a lot of the context of what could help them heal or give them the resources that they need exists outside of the context of mental health specifically, but still is very much tied to it, and so very important. So embracing a cross movement vision. So like I mentioned, situating mental health within a lineage of other social movements that have been created by and led by people with lived experience in pursuit of equity and justice in these different movements. So here on this list, we just mentioning a few, we have disability rights, disability justice, prison abolition, transformative justice, LGBTQIA rights, and human rights. And over here on the right, we just have some images and some logos about, or that are representative of some of these movements. So here we have the Mad Pride logo that is very much kind of indicative of the breaking free of the stigma of being mad. If you can see the person that is breaking out of the chains, and under it reads, "The right to be free, the right to be me." So that is indicative of, the Mad Pride movement that is very much tied to mental health. We also have the Black Lives Matter movement, which we know is a social and political movement fighting racism and anti-Black violence. And then Nothing About Us Without Us. It is a slogan that comes from, that originated in South Africa during a disability rights movement in the 90s. So essentially it's just, decisions about our lives, decisions about our health, decisions about things of that sort, need to include us and have our consent and need to be led by us, because, who knows better than people experiencing these things, what is happening to them and what is needed, to move forward. And just to situate, transformative mental health, which is a term that we use to describe, the liberatory mental health work that IDHA does and the community that we're trying to build, just to situate where we put that in the context of cross-movement building, we have a graph here with transformative mental health in the center that is connected to a multitude of different movements, much of which we have already mentioned. So here you can see we have Mad Pride, disability justice, Black Lives Matter, And then there's more that we haven't quite mentioned, but are definitely still very, very important, such as environmental justice, immigration justice, harm reduction, and things of that sort. So this graph is basically just to show the cross movement web. I feel like I can put it that way. Yeah, the web of just all the different movements that inform a lot of the lineages and frameworks and work that people who are doing the work of transformative mental health pull from, and who we are in collaboration with. And why a cross movement vision matters. So people who experience mental health challenges are a part of every marginalized community. And as kind of mentioned before, a lot of people who are labeled with, serious mental health diagnoses are more often than not disproportionately, Black and brown people or poor people, or just, people who are already marginalized. So just keeping that in mind, that, it's highly likely that a lot of people experiencing, the quote unquote worst of the mental health challenges are the most marginalized people of these groups. And yeah, as Audrey said, our struggles are intertwined. There's no such thing as a single issue struggle. So this list here is just some of the liberation struggles and things that are definitely connected to the mental health, the transformative mental health movement. So here we have, poverty, policing, housing, healthcare, marriage equity, mental health crisis response, building new jails, school to prison pipeline, guardianship and conservatorship, involuntary commitment. And yeah, just thinking about a lot of these things, because, when it comes to poverty and housing, of course, someone's going to be mentally unwell, if they don't have enough to provide for their basic needs, or if they don't have safe housing. When it comes to the school to prison pipeline, how Noah mentioned ODD, which is oppositional defiance disorder. Yeah. How Black boys are often more diagnosed with that. So just imagining, when some of the mental health struggles that they have are present in school, instead of getting the care that they need, they're getting suspended, they're getting sent to these alternative schools, which very much turns into a prison pipeline. And then guardianship and conservatorship, just basically taking someone who may be experiencing some sort of altered state, taking away their agency and making it seem like, they have no agency over themselves, or they're not fit enough to make decisions for themselves in their lives. So yeah, some people who are experiencing more extreme mental health issues and things of that sort, basically all of their agency is being taken away and legally signed to someone else to make decisions for their lives, which is a very vulnerable spot to be in. So just keeping all these things in mind about, why keeping all these things in mind is very important to build across movement strategies. Here, we have the web again that I mentioned before, but this time we have disability justice and healing justice highlighted, just because for this presentation, at least, these are going to be the two that we talk about, and how these two have really informed a lot of the work that IDHA does, and how they're intertwined with transformative mental health. Yeah, so healing justice is a political strategy to intervene and respond to generational trauma and systemic oppression. And this phrase was coined in 2006 by Kindred Southern Healing Justice Collective. If any of you are familiar with them, they are a Southern grassroots healing collective that does a lot of work to build community and survivor-led responses to sustain, marginalized people's, specifically people of color's, emotional, physical, spiritual, psychic, and environmental well-being. And these movements and initiatives are working to build capacity for and with marginalized people, and linking to, the roots and traditions of, Southern Black people and those ancestral lineages and those healing practices that have been a part of, their ancestors and their culture for a very, very long time, and just also attuning to the various systems of oppression that people who are situated within these social categories experience. And here on the side, we just have a picture of Kindred's logo, and then under that, we have some pictures of some protesters, like a montage of pictures, and in front of that, it has the words in cursive, healing justice. And just a quote here from Erica Woodman and Kara Page from the book Healing Justice Lineages. We open up to the possibility of interrupting patterns of violence and calling forth the strategies of resistance of those who came before. This is reclaiming ancestral patterns. So just thinking about, just like ancestral ways that people were in community or hair rituals that people engage in, and kind of like, I mentioned I'm an herbalist, so like really leaning into like ancestral herbal practices for like healing and medicine and things of that sort. So yeah, healing justice is just really, I would say, mostly just tied to reclaiming the wisdom that has been ours and has existed for a long time. And lessons learned from healing justice. Yeah, approaching care, safety, and collective healing with an acknowledgement of systemic violence and oppression. Just like, keeping in mind that a lot of our experiences of care or lack thereof, our experiences of safety or lack thereof, and healing, is really informed by the systems of oppression that, that we are subjected to, whether that be racism, sexism, classism, all the isms that I feel like I've said a few times in this presentation. But also some other lessons that we have are like uplifting and remembering ancestral practices of healing. So like I mentioned, rituals, whether those are care rituals for yourself and community, drum circles, like, communion, feeding people, prayer, meditation, altar building, all the different things that, people have done in the past and continue to do to care for themselves and their communities. And then also making sure that all of these practices are led and facilitated by those most impacted by these harmful systems. Because as I mentioned before, no one other than who is experiencing these things can be able to, really quantify, qualify what that experience is. And those are the people who know best what they would need to heal and feel cared for and to achieve a level of safety and collective healing for themselves. And here on the right, we have a picture of a brown hand with a heart in it and some clouds, flowers, hearts, stars, flowing from it. Yeah, just giving the spiritual, vibey, healing, justice vibes. Yeah, and I will pass it off to Noah to talk about disability justice.
Thanks, Nia. We're throwing a lot at you, and hopefully you will be able to get the slides, so hopefully you can digest some of it. And we're trying our best so that we can get to our Q&A at the end. So this is another example of the importance of cross-movement organizing, because these movements that we're highlighting are really founded by people of color, as an acknowledgement that there really wasn't as much representation and community led from those communities. And the consumer extirpation survivor movement that I mentioned in the 60s and 70s, unfortunately, was also the same, where it was a lot of white folks who were at the forefront of these movements and leadership, and really was not intersectional. So healing justice and then disability justice really is trying to address the fact that all people, including people of color, disabled folks, all people need to be part of these movements and recognized. So disability justice is a movement or a framework, some people call it, that was developed by Sins Invalid. That is a group that they coined this terminology, and it understands that all bodies are unique and essential, that all bodies have strengths and needs that must be met. And it's really guided by this approach to equitable access for people with disabilities, and really recognizing that there's intersectionality of disability with all other forms of oppression. So this is an image from Sins Invalid that says, all bodies are unique and essential, all bodies are whole, all bodies have strengths and needs that must be met. We are powerful, not despite the complexities of our bodies, but because of them. We move together with no body left behind. This is disability justice. And this is kind of a little bit of a different tone than some of the movement before, which was more focused on disability rights, right? Trying to make sure that the rights of people with disabilities are being upheld. And that was, more focused on protection of laws and a framework of government and law, and advocacy. And this is, I think, a little bit different in tone of more kind of a holistic approach of thinking more about, how do we create vibrant communities where disability is, not seen as lesser than, and kind of just how do we increase access and think about all of our intersections and the beauty that we all have together. That's kind of a different approach. So next slide. So Patty Byrne was one of the founders of Sins Invalid, and she wrote this. This is her quote: "People with disabilities are not oppressed by what we can or cannot do with our bodies or minds. We may be inconvenienced by living with impairment, but what oppresses us is the systemic prejudice, discrimination, segregation, and violence we face because we do not fall within a perceived norm." So this is kind of a different thinking towards disability, right? That it's often society that is disabling people. That is the disabling factor. So when we think about mental health, thinking about the fact that people who are not perceived as having normative mental wellness are kind of oppressed within that, and really are not getting their access needs met, right? They don't have the adequate care that they need. Next slide. So some of the lessons that we've learned from disability justice is it's the importance of creating solidarity amongst people that might use different terminology for their experiences. And so I talked about the consumer ex-patient survivor movement. That was a movement of people who used terminology like consumer, ex-patient, survivor. And that was kind of difficult for that movement because they didn't all agree on the way that they the way that they identified, and it created a lot of friction. And then people started using the word mad to describe their experience. I talk about my experience as having sensitivities. I don't really subscribe to having like a diagnosis. And some people are like, I have a mental illness. Some people say I'm disabled. So all of these different terminology, and how do we work together still and find our common cause, for liberation, and really acknowledge that we have different frameworks for how we experience the world, based on our own lived experience or, physical experience. And then there's also a lot of learning that we have, a lot of wisdom from disabled community, when it comes to thinking about capacity. Disabled folks have always been thinking about the kind of different shifts in our capacity based on, a day-to-day, and thinking about the slowness that we may all need, and the fact that we're not all supposed to be, just constantly working and grinding ourselves down to a pulp. So thinking about, how do we deeply rest, and how do we what is our access needs, right? Or what is the support that we need so that we can fully show up. And then also thinking about ableism and disability that are, intertwined with systems of power and oppression. So, society being the disabling factor, right? And like, if you don't have housing, that's gonna cause a serious effect on your body and how you show up in the world. In Palestine, Palestinians being actively disabled by Israel, right? And the missiles and the gunfire, all of these things, actively causing people to be disabled. So thinking about how society and the world disables. Next slide. So we want to leave you with this. This is like a question of thinking about the legacies of activism that you come from. You're going to get the slides after, so you can reflect on this on your own. But I think, as we are talking about legacies of activism, of movements, it's really important to ground in the movements that you come from and how they show up in the work that you're doing as a social worker or activist or whatever you're doing, and how, what is one issue in our current social or political landscape that demonstrates the importance of cross-movement approach to mental health. So just leaving you with that. And so next slide, we're just going to share some lessons that we have learned along the way that hopefully we can, impart that, part of the work, as I mentioned, that these movements have been very white dominated, right? Like the consumer exploitation survivor movement. So thinking about how whiteness shows up in these movement spaces and looking to decenter whiteness, right? And so looking at how do we bring in more voices, people of color, people who are not of that norm. And then also thinking about cross-movement work and how there's a lot of different goals like that might also be kind of contradictory sometimes and conflict. And so the importance of acknowledging that and like really kind of digging deep and thinking about like how do we all work together in that. And then finding language outside of the dominant models, like, oftentimes this kind of mental health discourse is used in a sort of, overwhelmingly medical framework. And that might often alienate a lot of people from, being part of the movement. So trying to find language outside of this dominant model can be really important to not alienating folks and working together. Next slide. And then, I mentioned it before in a previous slide, but, we also at this juncture have we're seeing the rise of authoritarianism, right wing across the world. So it's not just the US, right? So there's a huge network of global solidarity that we can tap into, that we can be part of, that might use different frameworks like psychosocial disability, for example, as opposed to like madness. And how do we work with our different, frameworks or language, and work across these borders. And then lastly, having an intersectional approach, right? We've already been talking about this throughout the presentation, that it's an important thing to, center the fact that there's so many different legacies of oppression in the US and in globally, and that these kind of lenses are really important to, center when we think about cross-movement organizing. So that was a mouthful, I know, and so we're gonna take some moments for some reflection. I hope that it wasn't too fast for one, but we're really happy to kind of take some questions and like I think we might have time for just a couple, but yeah.
So I'll jump in and read some questions as they're coming up here, but how do you think mental health professionals working within systems such as psychiatric hospitals or prisons and jails can uphold their abolitionist viewpoints and overall disagreement with the system? And is it even possible to work inside these facilities while claiming oneself an abolitionist?
It's a good question. I can take this one, Nia. I think we have a lot of conversations about this. We've had some panels talk about the importance of kind of as like people working in the system. I think there's some schools of thought that it's like, no, you can't you can't be an abolitionist, or you can't like really change the system from within. And then I think they're all like, I feel like abolition, for a lot of the approach is also Miriam Kabas talks about like 1 million experiments and really thinking about what are the experiments that we want to try. So like we can't like toppling down these systems isn't going to happen overnight always, right? So like what are the experiments that we can do within what the work that we're doing to try something else that is outside of the oppressive structures that is trying to foster a new way of being within, and I think that's very much possible for mental health professionals to be doing to really be changing their approach from the inside. That could really look like a thing of writing their progress notes differently. So thinking about progress notes and how oftentimes the language that one uses is quite pathological and kind of like using words that are kind of like labeling somebody and might be sort of rooted in this kind of medical industrial way of thinking. So trying to change the language to maybe a little more person-centered and like this person is experiencing XYZ or something like that. So there can be some experiments that we take, and I believe that people can take those next steps.
That's a great answer. Thanks. The other question, I think is you would kind of answer, but asking specifically what social workers could do to assist folks impacted by, it says this issue, but I think just in general, like you started that answer with talking about a one like really definitive way that social workers could do that is like, how do we, use our language and that power to not cause harm to folks. So someone else had a question about how has the MAD movement found common goals or solidarity with spiritual or religious communities?
Nia, let me know if you want to jump in. Yeah.
I'm okay answering this. I feel like in a lot of contexts, yes, I feel like it depends on how the individual mad person likes to qualify their experiences. I know that a lot of people who experience like extreme or altered states and things of that sort like to contextualize it as, gifts or like a spiritual experience that is happening. And I know a lot of people have found healing in, practitioners who honor that view of like how they experience those sort of things. As I mentioned before, I before coming into work of transformative mental health, I did a lot of like multi or like different dimensions of like liberatory theology, and just thinking about like there's a lot of different ways in different religious communities that people view liberation, and some of that is within like how people experience life in their body minds. So I really do think that it depends on who you talk to, kind of like we talked about the polyphony. I don't think we said that word in this in this presentation, but polyphony is a word that we use a lot at IDHA to basically describe that there are multiple truths to what people experience, and sometimes it can be conflicting. So I think that's like a yes and no question. It just depends on who you talk to and what are the intersections that exist within that mad person that would help them make sense out of their experiences. So I think that's what I have for that.
Yeah, and one thing I'll add about the question, what is social workers, what can they do, is I think it's both like recognizing that the power that you may have in a situation that you may exert over a client that might perpetuate continuing these systems of oppression, and at the same time looking at what are the ways that social workers are also part of oppressed systems who are dealing with being overworked by capitalism, right? dealing with maybe their own marginalizations and how that shows up in the workplace, maybe the fear that they have to try different approaches, and the kind of like top-down hierarchies that exist within these systems. So thinking about both, I think, is really important, and really just recognizing those things and trying to change. Um, you know, once there's recognition, there's more an impetus to change. So I think it starts with awareness, and then we can move outward from there. I think we're basically at time. I don't know if we want to answer one more question, but
There is one more question we can kind of throw out there. It's a longer one, but I think it's relevant to what we're talking about here. But so the question is around for folks who are practicing social justice work in systems where a diagnosis is what establishes kind of medical necessity and opens the possibility for meeting, welcoming, or co-practicing organizing. How and seeing how many young people with whom they work experience their diagnosis and pathologizations as a form of violence and constriction. And so wondering if anyone has thoughts on ways of approaching folks with whom we do work within systems where everything is downstream of othering diagnoses to subvert that violence. What other meanings of diagnoses can we co-create? That's a big question. Answer.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I feel like what Nia mentioned was really like a lot of people have kind of uh, some spiritual sort of meaning making around their experiences. For me, like I talk about that, and how like I think that there was a real need for me to transform, and so I feel like that was kind of a spiritual journey, and that's something that I've talked about with the young folks that I was working with, and so I think that there's a lot of different frameworks that we can use outside of just a diagnosis to understand the things that we're going through. And I think it's really just meeting the person where they're at, and then maybe offering some things that they could think about when it comes to their experiences of identity in the world, or their experiences of marginalization in the world, or what spiritual things, what meaning do they make out of life, and how does that transfer to what they're experiencing, what they're going through. I think a lot of people who are young folks, they don't like a diagnosis can feel really limiting, because it's like, I have this thing that's going to be there for the rest of my life, like, and maybe that could be helpful for some people. But I think that for a lot of young folks, for myself included, I think it's really trying to take like looking at your experiences of struggle, and how that is also part of just growing up, and I think that like you can see that as part of becoming the person that you're supposed to be becoming. So I feel like that, especially when it comes to working with young people, is a really important framework to use. I know that we're 3 minutes over. I just have two more slides, but thank you so much for tuning in. And we just wanted to quickly plug, we have this curriculum that we developed about a year and a half ago, that really delves into this idea, or some of the concepts that we talked about in this presentation about transformative mental health. And it's all about how can we transform our practices? How do we think about the multiple frameworks to thinking about mental health, our stories, the systems of oppression that we are intertwined with, and the different holistic practices that we can incorporate to our into our mental health, into our work, so that we're kind of like changing our approach, and experimenting. So if you're interested, this is a self-paced course. You can join as a self-paced or there's also a format where you can join others in like a cohort and learn together in these bi-weekly groups. So yeah, if you're interested, definitely look that up, to transformative mental health. And I'm not sure, Bethany, if we're going to send up any follow-up links, but we could do that to send some more information about that. And yeah, and then next, lastly, we would love for you to stay connected with us. Here's our emails if you would like to ask any questions about anything that we shared. And our website, here's some of our platforms. And if you'd like to learn more about the core curriculum, you can use the QR code here to check it out. So yeah, thank you so much for everyone tuning in, and yeah, for Bethany and all of the people that made this possible.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Noah and Nia, for this presentation. I would definitely suggest everybody go check out IDHA and the core curriculum. It's amazing. So yeah, if y'all have, time to, or find time to do it, let's just find time to do it. But thank you again to Noah and Nia for being here today, for their time, their expertise, their valuable information that they shared today. I hope that everyone watching will take these ideas and challenges into the work you're doing out in the world every day, and use this opportunity to connect with people from all over, hopefully through IDHA, to learn more and kind of change, your worldview on like mental health and what the system looks like for those of us who work in it are impacted by it. But thank you everyone for being here as a part of this event. Please remember and please join us at 2 p.m. Central Time today for our keynote featuring Kelly Hayes and Miriam Kaba. Again, that starts at 2 p.m. Central Time. And please watch for an email again with a link to complete the conference evaluation, and in a few weeks to watch for email with the CEUs. And remember, this session is recorded and will be posted on the conference website. So again, send folks to watch it, check it out again. And again, thank you for participating in the conference, and we hope to see you at 2 p.m. for our closing plenary. Have a good one.